our presenter today is Dr. Desi Rios, and I'll just hand it over to you. I'll just hand it over to you.
Thank you. I was wondering if you would allow me to pull up my PowerPoint. So if you can share the screen with me, that would be great. Yes. I think it says multiple participants.
Let's see how I do that. Well, I might need to make you the host. Is that okay?
I think if you go to share screen, and I think it says allow multiple participants to share or something like that.
Share computer sound. Is that in the advanced? Maybe that's in the advanced.
No. If you go to the bottom of the screen, you should see, or wherever your taskbar is, you should see a bright green button that says share screen.
Got it. Okay, yes. Okay, got it.
Okay, got it. Okay, great. Thank you. All right. So, oh, there we go. Okay. Good morning, people. Good to see everyone. I'm very honored that I was asked to speak with all of you today. I want to thank Reverend Mike Stone and also my wonderful colleague and friend, Dr. Gladden, for inviting me today. So I wanted to start off with saying, these are lessons on using intersectionality and privilege as tools for the greater good. I think right now there's a lot going on in our country and our world. And these are two phrases, intersectionality and tools, that we hear are used a lot. But in my conversations with a lot of people, it's not really clear what they mean, or people have different understandings of what they mean. And they're actually really powerful to think about how we might use them and become agents of good, of good change. Now, before we start, I was wondering if y'all would be generous enough to share. I can see your names on the screen, but if you go to the top of your screen, you'll see a little toolbar and the annotate button. Now, if you click on that, you should see another toolbar. And do you see text? If you click on text, you'll be able to type here. And later on, this will be useful because I'm going to ask you to participate in a few things, and you can see it is anonymous. So for later, if you feel a little shy about answering some questions, you don't have to worry about being identified. But in this case, and I wasn't sure how to state this because I wasn't sure who would be on this call, but your name, what do you do with your day? So whether that's some type of paid work or some type of volunteer work or whatever it is, just tell me a little bit about yourself. And I'd also like to know if you're a Houston native.
No, I don't see it here.
So go to the very top and you'll see a taskbar. If you scroll over to annotate, click on that.
I don't see it at all.
I had to use a drop down to get, I went to the taskbar and there was a drop down there on the right by where it says share screen or something.
Wonderful.
And then I dropped down.
Okay. And then you click on text.
Oh, I see it.
Oh, there, we see it now.
I never thought I'd be teaching these sorts of technology things, but with the pandemic, I find myself learning all kinds of neat stuff.
I'm not getting what I'm supposed to click on.
Dr. Gladden, would you like to help explain again? You're on mute.
Yeah, I'm really impressive on technology, am I not? If you go to the very top, there's something that says view options and there's a drop down. And if you click that, then you roll down to annotate.
It says what? Oh, view, okay.
View options. And then
that's what I couldn't hear. Annotate.
And then once that toolbar pops up, you choose text, and then just place your cursor on the slide and type.
Then what do I put on the, what do I click on the toolbar?
Text.
Text, ah, see it. Nothing's happening.
Well, then you have to click on the screen and start typing.
And then hit enter. Wonderful.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, everyone. So now, if this is in another meeting, someone asks you to do this, you'll impress all your friends with knowing this little trick. Okay, but thank you. So we do have several native Houstonian, 6th generation, and several native Texans, and then also some folks who have been here quite a while, and then different, okay, and then different types of work. All right, very interesting. Thank you so much for sharing. Oops. Okay. Oh, I keep doing that. Okay, so a little bit about me, and the reason I asked you will become obvious in a second. I'm from Los Angeles, and so for any of you that are following sports, go Lakers! They just won again. I'm from Los Angeles, and this map shows you everywhere that I've lived. So I've lived all over the United States and most of the regions, and as a result, I've noticed that people in different places in the United States, there are different cultures, and even folks who are considered to be part of a particular background. So for example, white Americans, y'all are different depending on where you live in the United States, right? And Latinos as well, et cetera, et cetera. So I went on to earn my PhD at the University of Michigan, which is why I have a little pin there near Detroit. And I hold a PhD in personality and social psychology and also in women's studies. And part of my experience in higher education has also been teaching at different types of institutions. So the University of Michigan, which is a huge research institution. I also taught at Bowdoin College in Maine, which is a teeny weeny selective liberal arts college, 1,200 students approximately. And now I'm at the University of Houston Clear Lake, which is medium size. It's a comprehensive, considered Hispanic serving institution in the South. And along the way, I've noticed that students too are very different depending on type of institution they go to, where they grew up. And so this all really was part of what I've been thinking about my entire life, is assuming that one identity really defines us. So being Latina, right? And certain assumptions that come with that, but I'm much more complicated than that, right? There's so many other things about me, including where I grew up, where I've lived, my profession. And so as a graduate student, I learned about this term, intersectionality, this theory, and it helped me understand the experiences of different groups of folks, not just in the United States, but worldwide. And so we're going to do that exercise again. So if you can pull down your text box and write a quick anything you'd like. Have you ever heard of intersectionality before? Or what is your understanding of intersectionality? Or anything else you'd like to tell me about intersectionality. So again, going to the taskbar. Hitting annotate and then text. Never heard of it. Is anyone else going to, are we good? Okay, complexity makes us more interesting. Okay, wonderful. Now, I'm gonna move on here. Okay, all right. All right, so what is intersectionality? This is a term that was coined by legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw in the early 90s. And here she was thinking about how different social institutions, different groups of people really have different experiences with them. So if you see on the right side, around the outer layer of this circle, you see this word structural, right? And so thinking about economic, the law, criminal justice system, education, religion, media, representation in the media, all these things. Kimberly Crenshaw had been thinking about for a while, and that they don't all serve each group in the same way, or various groups in the United States don't have the same access to them. And so intersectionality is watered down. It is both a theory and a research method, but it is an integrative perspective that emphasizes the intersection of several attributes, for example, race, class, and nation. It was developed in the 1970s and 80s by women of color, including Black women, Chicanas, Native Americans, Asian women, but also women with disabilities were thinking about this. Lesbian, bisexual women, transgender women, and working class women. And this was during the second wave of feminism, so the women's movement, where a lot of these women felt that the movement was not representing their needs, or they felt very invisible in this movement. And so they were writing about, at certain intersections of identity, and I'll give you some examples, lots of examples coming up, that they really felt invisible. Now recall at this time, the civil rights movement, they'd just also come out of, oh, is there a psychology professor here? Who's the psychology professor? Just interested to know.
The one with the perfect last name, Nut.
Right, putting the psycho in psychology.
Yeah, but
all
we
of us.
have Darlene Hunter, who's a psychology professor from UHCL.
I'm sorry, who?
Darlene Hunter.
Okay.
Darlene is also a psychologist.
Okay. Oh, in any case, so they were writing this theory to better understand the experiences of marginalized groups. So for example, women with disabilities within the women's movement. But I want to emphasize that it can be used to understand any group because we have multiple identities. So it's not just for understanding marginalized groups of folks. Oops. Okay, so when we talk about intersectionality, we talk a lot about identity, social identity. So what does that mean? Social identity is a person's sense of self, which is based on that individual's affiliations with different groups. And so we're thinking about which social characteristic a person holds or how they identify themselves in this way. And then what kind of power, and I'll talk a little bit more about power in a second, comes with that identity. So age, we know that adults have more power than children or adolescents, but depending on where you fall in that, on the life trajectory, younger people, middle-aged people tend to have more power over elders. Now, of course, that is depending on culture. developmental disability, neurotypical individuals tend to have more power compared to neurodivergent individuals. In the United States, for example, for religion, Christians tend to have more power in the United States compared to Jews, Muslims, atheists, or other non-Christians. Ethnicity, we hear this a lot about European Americans or white privilege, hold more power than people of color, and etc. And so there's lots of examples here for who typically holds more power in the United States and who holds less. Now, I'm sure some of you are starting to think, wait a second, I don't really feel like I have more power than other groups. And that is the problem with this analysis when you only consider membership in one group. So being a man or being a white person or being a Christian, right? So this is where intersectionality comes in. So is the best way to understand the experience of groups who experience multiple discriminations simply additive? So do we simply think about race plus racism, etc., or racism plus sexism, etc.? And so the thinking was, do we just add up the experiences of Black men plus white women's experiences? And does this equate to a Black woman's experience? And so women of color were saying, no, it really doesn't. And so it is more useful to think of the metaphors of a necklace versus a cake, and cake always makes things better, right? So I like to use this metaphor. But if you think of a necklace, you're simply adding different beads, right? And assuming that these can be taken off or added depending, right? But a cake is something that you're baking in a lot of different ingredients. For it to be its whole self, it must include all of these ingredients. And I like this picture of this cake in particular because there's a lot of frosting on it. So. All right, so when we're talking about intersectional identities, I'm starting to wake up, folks. Please forgive me. I'm not a morning person, so this is, so my personality will come out in a second. I can feel it coming up with enough coffee. So when we're talking about intersectionalities, we also have to think about social stratification. So the idea that people are ranked in a hierarchy, such as some people and groups have more power and status than others, as I mentioned. And so our intersecting identities provide a complex access to power for each possible combination of identities. And this is really important, and I'm going to talk more about this at the end because this is one of the strengths of intersectionality. So developing the capacity to work together across difference or perceived differences is often seen as the best approach for undoing the overall structure of oppressive forces. When we're talking about social identities, again, we're thinking about our race, our sexual orientation, our gender identity, nationality, disability, and how these all sort of overlap together to make up who we each are. But it's not just that. So, characteristics that are associated with members of dominant versus subordinate groups. So thinking about, in the dominant group, this group has access to power and resources. They also establish norms and standards. They have limited awareness of or knowledge of subordinate groups and are believed to be competent and credible. So they're often given the benefit of the doubt. They create truth or reality, and I'm going to give you lots of examples of this as we move along. They are seen as individual and not representative of their group. And then they have a sense of belonging in most places that they go. Whereas a member of a subordinate group has reduced access to power and resources. They're perceived as less than or deviant from dominant norms and standards. They have an increased awareness of and knowledge about dominant groups. And they're viewed suspiciously or not given the benefit of the doubt. And they have their truth and experiences dismissed and invalidated. And they're seen as representing their entire group. And they often feel invisible, or if they're the only person in there, I noticed one of you said you work for NASA. And in these fields, often, you know, it's changing now, but oftentimes women were the only ones in the room. And so this sense of being hyper visible. So this question of which do I identify with? feminist scholars and critical race scholars really started to ask, is that the right question when we're thinking about coalition building, alliances? And so they argued that we have to understand people within a matrix of domination and subordination. And this is the idea that each system of bias, so racism, homophobia, sexism, these are all interconnected with each other. And they stem from the same system of social stratification. So androcentrism, which means centering men's experiences, or capitalism, heterocentrism, ethnocentrism, these are all interrelated and inform each other. So intersectionality is about the way things work rather than who people are. That's really important. It is about the way things work rather than who people are. And so when we are thinking about people, we are thinking about them in the context of social structures. So education, media, the legal system, and how different groups experience these structures. Intersectionality is not a list of personal characteristics. Intersectionality is not a list of personal characteristics. So saying someone's race, sexual orientation, gender, ability status, nationality, that is not intersectionality, that is describing someone. Any questions before I move on? We're going to have another exercise here in a second. Okay. Now, go back to your text boxes and type in, again, remember you're anonymous, so it's okay if you don't get this quote unquote right. I know we get a little nervous when we're asked to define something. What is privilege and why does it matter? What is privilege and why does it matter? Okay. Okay, these are all elements of how we understand privilege. Yeah, okay, wonderful. So let me. Okay, so it seems like this group has a pretty good idea of what we mean when we're talking about privileges, but I wanted to go through this list that most of you refer to in some way. So privilege is the social, economic, and or political advantages that people enjoy simply because they're part of a certain group rather than because of anything they did or failed to do. And so aspects of privilege include unearned entitlements, so things of values that should be provided to everyone but aren't. And privileged groups are seen as normal or the default. Can y'all think of things that should be provided to everyone but are not in the United States? And it's very much tied to this idea of that you should earn these things. You don't have to type this out. You can shout it out.
Healthcare.
Healthcare, okay.
Education.
Good. Education. Anything else? I often think of the people in Flint, Michigan, right? We should all have access to clean water, but they do not. Visibility. Individuals with multiple marginalized social characteristics are often invisible in the media, in curriculum we learn at school. Conferred dominance is the idea that one group is socially assumed to have more authority or power over another group. Legitimizing beliefs. These are attitudes, values, and beliefs that exist to justify social hierarchies. And again, I know these are a lot of terms, I'm defining a lot of stuff, but I'm going to give you some daily examples that we've all are familiar with. Okay, so let me start. Oh, let me clear this first of all. Let's see, because this will follow us everywhere. Okay, so unearned entitlements. So I don't know if y'all are familiar with the idea of colorism, but in communities of color, lighter skinned individuals tend to have a lot more privilege. And so an example of this is actress Zoe Saldana was cast to play the role of Nina Simone. And there was a lot of backlash because darker skinned actresses had auditioned for the role, and Zoe Saldana was selected. And as you can see, Nina Simone is on the right. She has much more African features, you know, a larger nose, bigger lips, whereas Saldana is much lighter in her skin tone than Simone was. And she has more European features, smaller nose, smaller lips. A more egregious example is more recent, where studio executives were casting for the movie about Harriet Tubman's life. And in that room, one person suggested that they hire Julia Roberts to have a really big name in the role, and she should play Tubman. Now, someone else was in the room, luckily, who said Tubman was Black. And they said, but that was so long ago, no one will remember. And so rewriting all of history, right? Just completely rewriting it because they had the privilege to do so, right? They were in the room, they were writing the script. But there was some, fortunately, people in the room who said, no, that's not appropriate. And so the actress Cynthia Erivo was cast, and as you can see, she looks a lot more like Harriet Tubman than Julia Roberts. So oftentimes people, you know, that I've talked with, and there's lots of research to confirm this, push back on this idea. I don't have any privilege. Everything I've had, I've earned. And privilege is not about never experiencing challenges or earning things, but privilege is most often invisible to those who experience it, even among people who are socially conscious and trying to address inequality. And because both people have both subordinate and dominant identity characteristics, people can be in one or more privilege groups, but still not think that they have a great deal of privilege. And the problem with not recognizing our privileges is that it can lead to this idea of scapegoating. So blaming a person or group for things that are not their fault. And so we see this a lot, for example, at the border right now, and all the folks in detention centers. And oftentimes I've heard if they had done it legally, they wouldn't be in that situation. Their children would not have been taken away from them. And so I'm reading this comment at the privilege is being part of the dominant group and it gives you power and access. Yes. So let me, okay. And so one of my favorite social psychologists is Aida Hurtado. And she wrote a book called The Color of Privilege, which is really powerful. And one of the things in the book that she says that really struck me was that we're all potentially in the oppressor category, because whether we have power over another varies from context to context and is primarily determined by race, class, and gender. And so here she was asking all of us, including people of color, for her, Latino people, to reflect on, when do we have that privilege and how are we using it? And so it might be being lighter skinned. It might be social class privilege. In my case, I'm highly educated, which gives me some privilege. And, some of you might be thinking she earned it, and I did. But along the way, I was helped a lot in ways that other people were not offered that same assistance. And so thinking about all of my privileges, I had a parent who was consistent throughout my life. More recently, I've been working with a foster care agency here in Houston. And just that stability alone is a privilege I didn't earn, right? That was my mother's doing. And other people don't have that kind of privilege. And that really helped to set a foundation for me to build on. So thinking about, in which context do we have that privilege? And also thinking about using it to elevate others. So there are 4 ways to think about intersectionality. So we want to think about who's been left out. We can also look at it through a mathematical interaction, thinking about relation to powers, and then the opportunity for coalition, which is my favorite. So approach, who's been left out? Now this might seem like, not a big deal example, but it is for Black women. So in the 90s, there was a lawsuit against American Airlines because they had written a policy that said they had a grooming policy, and that all employees, regardless of race or gender, had to abide by it. And so one of those violations of the grooming policy were braids. And Black women claimed that Rogers claimed that as a Black woman, she was disparately impacted by the policy, but she lost the case because it was not about race or sex discrimination. American Airlines argued, no, regardless of your race, wearing braids to work is a violation of our grooming policy, regardless of your gender or sex, whether you're a man or a woman. But of course we know that it is Black women who tend to wear this hairstyle most often. And so this is an example of who's being left out in policies or the law curriculum that we learn. Another example is going back to the civil rights movement. It didn't address women's concerns. So whether it was the Black power movement, the Chicano power movement, Native American movement, the LGBT movement, they didn't address women's concerns. And the women's movement didn't address race well. The labor movement didn't address gender or race. And so Black women got left out, which resulted in books like this famous book, All the Women Are White, All the Blacks Are Men, but Some of Us Are Brave. Which brings me to intersectional invisibility. This theory argues that possessing multiple subordinate group identities renders a person invisible relative to those with single subordinate group identities. So people who have multiple subordinate group identities are defined as non-prototypical members of their respective identity groups. So ethnic minority men are most visible. And so the thinking here is that they should suffer the most discrimination, right? They are the prototype. When we think of Black people, we think of Black men. But how is being invisible sometimes worse than being highly visible? And so most recent cases of police violence include George Floyd from this past summer and Breonna Taylor. And so we see a lot of movement around George Floyd, but a lot less about Breonna Taylor. Now, I think people are much more aware now of intersectional invisibility, although they might not be saying that or using that term. So there has been more movement than we've seen historically around the Breonna Taylor case. But the Black Lives Movement, initiative was started by the mothers of Black men who had been killed by some kind of violence. And but we see that most of the efforts have been focused on Black men, right? And so sort of leaving Black women out because Black women tend to be more invisible in these movements. Okay, so this.
Question, Desi?
Sure.
So early on you used the phrase hypervisible.
Yep.
You saw on the previous slide highly visible. Could you just distinguish those two experiences?
Highly versus hyper?
Yes.
So highly visible would be, so if you are a prototype of a group, so also when we think of the LGBT community or even gay men, we think about white, right? White gay men. And so they would be the prototype. They are more highly visible in that community. Hypervisibility has to be when you are the only one, so a token. Oftentimes diversity initiatives are well-intentioned, and so they'll hire one person with no support around them. And so that single person feels like, wow, my entire group's reputation is resting on my shoulders. So any small, mess up I make here is going to reflect on the entire group. Does that help? Yes? Okay. Let me know, because my brain is still waking up this morning. Okay, so a mathematical interaction is another way to think about intersectionality. So for example, the effect of gender on an outcome, so such as salary or well-being, differs depending on the person's race or other characteristic. Oftentimes when we hear about, women getting paid 80 cents on the dollar, we assume that means all women, but that really is referring to what white women make. And so the Pew Research Center conducted this study a few years ago where they controlled for education, and they looked at the intersection of race and gender. And so they found here that in some cases, white women made either the same as some groups of men, right? So in this case, they make roughly the same as Black men. And so across groups of women, Black women make, I believe, is it 76 cents on the dollar, and Latina women make 55 cents compared to white men. And so if we don't look at these intersections, then everybody sort of gets, jumbled in together. And the assumption is that there is sort of, I don't want to say equity or equality, but kind of, right? If you're only looking at this single identity, gender, for example. So categories like race and gender aren't just about identity. So Aida Hurtado, who I mentioned earlier, uses this idea of seduction and rejection to describe the different relationships to power among white women and women of color. Now, if we look at the highest level of power in our nation, who do white men marry? And it's not just on the right, it's also on the left. And so there is a lot of privileges that you get, right, as a white woman to support the current system. And so categories like race and gender aren't just about identities, they're also about power. And so Antonio Gramsci, who was a sociologist, argued about this idea of hegemony. And this idea tells us that dominant groups get and keep power by persuading subordinated people that beliefs that favor the ruling group are natural, or they're just common sense. So his thinking here was ruling by ideas is easier and cheaper than ruling by force, right? So if we can convince everyone that this particular group just is naturally better at, you know, whatever, that's much easier than like forcibly, physically dominating them. And these ideas are disseminated via social institutions. So this might be in the law, in the media, in curriculum that we learn. And so these hegemonic ideas are just normal. They're dominant, and we all engage with them. And so here we see aspects of privilege, conferred dominance, unearned entitlements, and legitimizing beliefs that I talked about earlier. And let me give you another example of what this looks like. So a hegemonic version of US history. Native Americans have been pleading, begging forever to listen to their experience of Christopher Columbus as not a discoverer, but as an invader of the Americas. And yet, because of conferred dominance, because of entitled access to power, the US, the White House released this proclamation on Columbus Day insisting that more than 500 years ago, Christopher Columbus's intrepid voyage to the New World ushered in a new era of exploration and discovery. So that framing is the dominant framing. And that is the one that we teach in schools. We have a holiday. And the argument here was, sadly, in recent years, radical activists have sought to undermine Christopher Columbus's legacy. So this is an example of privilege and who gets to decide which version is the legitimate version. Okay, so my favorite thing about intersectionality, and something I've been working on a lot these last few years, is developing my own skills and consciousness around this, is the opportunity for coalitions. So social movements don't have to be based on shared identity. Instead, groups that share subordination or have a common cause can figure out, like, where do we overlap here? And so, for example, Kimberly Crenshaw argues that groups working for racial justice are coalitions of men and women. And so here's a picture of women during the second wave who, you know, you can see it's a pretty diverse group of women here, and they were working on issues related to gender. And so Kathy Cohen is a critical race scholar. She wrote that the moment of intersection is really the moment of building a broader movement. If you can find those places where people may not agree, but where they in fact suffer from the same state relation or some system of oppression, where they shape that experience, those are also the spaces for shared mobilization. And so we have all these historical examples, which is unfortunately not something that we learn in school about. So the Mexican-American farm labor movement tends to dominate that history, but there was also the Filipino farm workers movement. And so Mexican-American and Filipino-American farm workers formed a coalition together. This is Cesar Chavez, who we all know, right? So that's the privileged status here, is Cesar's versus Larry Itliong, who was just as much of a fantastic leader and visionary as Chavez was. And then we know during the civil rights movement, lots of white Americans and African Americans got together to work on these issues of racial injustice. And then the 2017 Women's March brought together all kinds of people, because the young folks are thinking intersectionally, and they knew that they couldn't just address gender. They had to think about, you know, how climate change was affecting different groups of folks, families, how, you know, reproductive rights, you know, pay disparity, all of these things. And so this is Austin at the top, where I actually went to march. At the bottom is my hometown of Los Angeles. And then you see here on the left, men joining this coalition at the movement. I saw more men at this march than I'd seen across my life in my participation of these sorts of marches, which was made me really hopeful that we are talking to each other and hearing each other, even though it seems like we're not right now in this country, that we actually are, and understanding what we need to do to help each other. And then on the right is, of course, my family, who went to the Women's March, who a long time ago would not have participated because they felt that there was nothing there for them, right? And now they're starting to understand it and see it and feel more included. So I want to end on allyship and coalition building. And there's two concepts that I wanted to share with you. Intersectional political consciousness is an idea that was developed by a fantastic graduate of UHCL, Ronnie Greenwood, who has gone on to do amazing things in my field. And she argued that developing our intersectional lens can really help us do this intersectional work. And in her research, she found that groups that had high diversity, but also saw issues through a singular lens, so this is only about race, or this is only about gender, had low solidarity in that group, and those groups tended to fall apart. Groups that had high diversity and high intersectionality, so the members of that group understood, okay, we're talking about pay disparity, but it's going to look different for Black women compared to white women compared to Latinas. Those groups had high solidarity. They were able to accept more creative ideas and approaches to these issues and think about, okay, now how do we work together as a group? I also want to introduce the idea of intersectional cultural humility, so not competence. We often hear this word, cultural competence, and it's this idea that if you take enough classes, get enough education, ta-da, you'll be an expert on a culture that you didn't grow up in. But intersectional cultural humility argues that this is a process rather than an outcome. So it's not about one day you become an expert. And it requires ongoing and frequent self-reflection on power. So if we think about cultural values or practices, we don't just have to think about it in terms of race or nation. We can also think about it in terms of gender and how men might approach things versus women. It also recognizes the need for ongoing learning and understanding the social context in which people are living in. It also encourages us to think about a person's experience, that it exists within the context of socio-political systems and historical context. Throughout my life, I've been told, don't let that comment upset you, or don't worry about it, just go on, be strong, I wouldn't let it bother me, right? Without understanding that this isn't the first time I had experienced racism or sexism. This was an ongoing experience across my lifespan, and that is because our culture allows for that. Also, intersectional cultural humility asks us to acknowledge our own privileged social locations, and that this severely limits our perspective. We simply can't know everything, and that's okay. That's okay. But to take that humble perspective, rather than assuming that we do know everything, and that our privilege often makes oppressive systems invisible to us. So we feel like everything's going great, and we start to imagine that that might be the case for everyone too. So to recap, there's two levels for thinking about intersectionality and individual's experience. So identities are always multiple. For example, no one has a race without their gender. But also importantly, this is the key, to think about structural relationships between the categories. So how do categories overlap, interact, and sometimes reinforce each other? And so again, to remind you of this little wheel, we cannot understand intersectionality outside of social structures. And that is all I have for you. And I hope I did leave some time for us to talk about if you had any questions, or here's my contact information if you'd like to talk further about this one-on-one. Sometimes it takes me a while to think about stuff, and then I'll contact the speaker later.
I like to focus on taking action. I mean, I've seen lots of intersectionality presentations and done them, but your focus on what do we do with it and put groups together is really, really nice, Desi.
Thank you.
Well, I really enjoyed it too, because it does talk about things that we can do and how we can actually apply it. And I think it's really great that it came right after Laura's presentation last week, where she was talking about cultural dimensions. Because particularly if you're a member of any of the dominant groups, you just dismiss the other cultures because you don't understand where they're coming from. So knowing something about the cultural dimensions then at least gives you a way to find some common ground to then move forward.
Yes, absolutely. And I think sometimes in my experience when I talk to, I'm taking a leadership class right now, and I was paired one-on-one with a white woman who was so angry with me that I talk about these things. And so I was listening to her and trying to not react because she was very attacking, but to try to reiterate the point that this work is not to take anything away from anyone. It really is not. And I have a feeling y'all talk about how there is enough for all of us. And it's just identifying when we might not recognize our own privilege and how that behavior might prevent others from also enjoying the things that make our lives good.
Well, I think that perhaps we who are privileged think that the pie is only so big, and that we don't want to lose our part of the pie, and that may be what's motivating us sometimes.
So those are hegemonic ideals. Someone told us that.
Yeah.
And we all just accepted it. Yeah, there's a lot on this earth. Going back to the Native American example, they have so many beautiful lessons to share with us, and that there is enough, but we also have to, respect our earth, each other. Wonderful observations so far, by the way.
The reason I say that is because when I was working in upstate New York, I was working at a university, and there's a conference there of Native Americans. And one of the things that they were angry at was the African Americans, because they felt that there was only so much part of the pie, and the African Americans were getting more than the Native Americans were getting. And that kind of shocked me at the time.
Yes. So you point out an important point that people of color are discussing is, again, the prototype. So when we think of oppressed groups, right, who do we think of first? And so other groups become invisible. Now, it doesn't have to be that way. So recognizing our privilege in different ways. So it sounds weird to say, like, in that way, Black Americans are privileged, because it sounds weird, right? But in terms of visibility and whose issues get addressed, they are. And there's some power there, though, to help other groups. So I use the example of the farm workers movement in that, although they still struggle there, but they are the group who is prototypical. And so their issues are being addressed, whereas the Filipino farm workers, I mean, how many of you know about that history? Probably not, right? It's completely invisible. And so in the common way that we understand privilege, it sounds icky to say it that way. But when I'm teaching this to my students and they say, well, I'm a Black woman, I grew up in a single parent household, I'm not privileged. And I'll point out, but you are getting a master's degree. So how do you use that? How do you recognize that? How do you maybe use it unconsciously against others, but how do you use it to elevate others, not just yourself? And that's the hard work, is to do that self-reflection.
Desi, I wanted to ask you about the role of the church here, but in listening to what you've said in the past couple of minutes, I think I've come to realize something about that very question, which is that the church, of course, is empowered, and by way of that, so are its members. The Episcopal Church has a long history of social activism and commitment to causes of this sort.
Right.
And of course, gathering in groups like this, we learn and then carry out into the world ways of thinking, strategies for being, and so forth. What advice can you give us as an outsider, someone who's not part of our church? What direct action can we take that would both reflect what we've learned today and challenge the way of the world?
Oh boy, that sounds like, what are some actions you can take? So can you give me an example of some things y'all are working on that'll help? Because again, depending on what it is, it's going to require tailored approaches for that issue or that group.
Let me defer to Father Mike about that one. He can give, I think, the most complete list. Oh, there are a lot of things, but Mike, would you say?
I mean, I think a lot of times we come to one of these meetings and we think, okay, now that we're educated, we're going to have a lot more diversity in our regular parish, which obviously isn't the case, right? I mean, it's not like because we've had a series, Black transgender women are going to say like, yes, we're going to show up in droves now, and we'll see all of those, colored faces, which will make us feel really good. I mean, it doesn't work like that. So I think the biggest initiative, quite honestly, that is underway, and it's slower than I thought, which means it'll probably work, is intentionally increasing the diversity at our school. We have a pre-K 3 through 5th grade school that is going to grow to 8th grade in the next 2 or 3 years. And we're working really hard not only on raising funds, but on having a cross-curricular, I don't want to say diversity training, that's not right. It's really like dignity affirmation that cuts across every student's experience and goes home with students to their families each night, so that when diversity shows up on campus, it's not whitewashed, it's appreciated, and families do the work we start at school so that it really is a family experience. And that takes money as well. And so, like some people don't like the word reparations, and that's fine. The word we use in the church is repairing the breach. So it's an opportunity for those who have resources essentially to make room for students who don't. And along the way, there's opportunities for docents and mentors. I actually feel really great about that approach. It's multi-pronged, it's inward and outward looking. The only thing it needs right now is money, but they make more of that almost every day. So maybe we'll find that. As a church, it's a little bit harder, right? Because we brand ourselves an open and inclusive parish, and typically that really shows up in the LGBTQ community. I think we do a pretty good job of that. We're a little rough around the edges sometimes. We have three Black members, I can count them. We have several Latinx members, harder to count. We have much more of those. Some international members. That's the hard thing. It's like, the church is intentionally very inclusive, and I think it is. I do. the services are very, have diverse music, they have diverse prayers from around the world, you know, like there's some intentionality there. I
So
don't
my
know
first question is, why does diversity matter to the church? Why is diversifying the school important?
Yeah, well, for our, you know, and should I answer that question?
So you don't have to answer it right now. If you would like to, that's fine, but this is something to think more deeply about, is why does that matter for your church? Because I have also seen organizations or, you know, departments at universities who, or I did some, I was a reviewer for the National Science Foundation's advanced grants, which is to diversify STEM fields at universities. And, you know, they use this word and it's important, and oftentimes it's not contextualized. Why does it matter for your particular context?
I do think it's important for us to think about that just really briefly. I mean, honestly, home ownership in our neighborhood, immediate neighborhood, it's all white. There are really not people of color that own homes in our neighborhood. A few Latinx families, there may be 2 or 3 Black families in the neighborhood. In terms of renters, there's much more diversity, and those people are more proximal physically to the church. So I think diversity matters in the sense that if we're a neighborhood parish, then we should look like the neighborhood.
Yes, but for some reason you don't.
I think there's a lot of reasons for that, not just one. And part of it, yeah, no, absolutely. And I think the same with the school. The school is harder, right? Because the school is like $10,000 a year, so that is socioeconomically not accessible to everybody.
Right. Yes. So I think also to think about, are the efforts for diversity for your own educational benefits, or what are you offering to different groups of people? Because if it's solely for your own educational benefits, people pick up that vibe, you know.
Yeah.
And they're tired of teaching.
I would think in the case of the church, it's because we're all God's children. And we talk about that all the time. And we would like to include people. And because of past injustices, we probably do need to give some other groups some help.
Yes, and this is important, intention, and then how that plays out behaviorally. Mm-hmm. And this is some work actually that Samuel knows we're doing on our campus right now, is a lot of our colleagues are so well-intentioned and have so much goodness in their hearts. But we thought, as a social scientist, we need to start talking to our colleagues to find out what is their basic understanding about these ideas. Mm-hmm. And then that's where we start building up. And we're finding that most of our colleagues have wonderful definitions of diversity, inclusion, best practices, but then when we're asked, how do you implement those best practices? I would say 98% of them will say, oh, I don't. And so it's making that connection, that bridge, which, oh, I forgot to mention my bridge metaphor is the missing pieces, right? How do we bridge our intentions to our behaviors? And that's hard work. And a lot of that takes a self-reflection, intersectional cultural humility. So my answer is, I don't know. It's hard work. It is. But it's understanding your institution. It is understanding the motivation. It is understanding the baseline knowledge. And then how do we behaviorally implement those good intentions? Samuel, that was a huge question, and I did not answer it.
No, you did. You did. And all of your remarks today, I think, are responsive to that question. That's a real challenge for us, mm-hmm. because I very much appreciate the initial graphic you shared of the wheel, and the perimeter of that is structural. How do we get outside of that? can we get outside of that? And if we can't, and we can't, right? Because that's what encloses the whole piece. Then how do we work within that in ways that do good? And you've been, I think, very informative and insightful in sharing some strategies with us.
Yeah, I think the thing I most appreciate is thinking about what the intent is, and is the intent so that we can look a certain way, or is the intent so that we can be a certain way?
That's right.
And that, I think, is like where a lot of us maybe get stuck, and like there are historic Black parishes in Houston. There are communities that are honestly as kind of homogenous as our own, whether that's Latinx communities or Muslim communities. And we do have the opportunity to at least coordinate around things like service that we agree upon, even if we have different sort of styles or theologies of worship. And the question is, can we, it's finding ways we can agree and build relationships seems the most important thing for us to do.
I often wonder if like coalitions are more effective than, and this is just off the top of my head, but thinking about how different parishes or churches might work together on a common cause versus, like you said, just having like the superficial, diversity. Like we have this many of this group and this many in this group and that sort of thing. But instead thinking about how y'all might work together on a common cause.
Yeah, it's, what's funny about it is that churches are like some of the most competitive places I've ever been a part of. And maybe it's not just their members, it's also the clergy. So
Sure.
to say like, we're going to have a backpack drive, it's sort of like, well, we're going to get more than you are. And that's like a really, like, supposedly that's fun, but I don't think so. And, or like, no, if we work with that, then our members might start going to your church. So we're not going to do that, which is like bizarre, like it's just really strange, but that's how we are, sadly.
So it's thinking about, are you motivated by love or fear? Yeah. And that's also like a hegemonic ideal, like the motivation of fear. If you do this, you're going to lose that, versus if I do this, I might actually elevate not just me, but others. And research shows across, I think, 20 years now, is these efforts, and they're slow, they take a long time, but when we take care of the most vulnerable in our communities, everyone feels better, including the most privileged. Like we all feel better. We all do better. So the most privileged don't feel like, well, I had to give away so much in order for this other person to get something, right? They don't feel that way. Everybody feels better. Spread that around. Spread it around.
In our neighborhood where St. Thomas is, just down the street is St. Paul, and so is Gloria Day. But I don't, I'm not the pastor. I'm a member of St. Thomas. But I hadn't thought about that until you're talking about how they're within 3 blocks of each other. I don't know I don't know, Mike, if there's
a great case study. Again, I can't even get people to return my calls or emails from those places, and I just gave up,
Those are a really long 3 blocks.
They're a long 3 blocks, and they don't need us. They're much bigger. They're much more important. They're too important to return my phone calls. So, part of it is I could persist, and part of it is like I don't need to. I shouldn't have to fight that hard to work together on projects.
Well, I just see them geographically, so I don't know. I'm sorry.
It's a case in point. It's nuts. I love that St. Paul's does a food distribution every week. Why we couldn't coordinate that, I have no idea. Because we were doing it before they were. I'm glad that they're doing it.
Right.
One way we had some coordination was before the pandemic, when Days for Girls was working.
Yeah.
That brought some very different churches together. And I hope that'll come back after the pandemic is over.
They were all primarily Episcopal churches.
They were.
You know, if we think again about structure, and I think Kathy or Graciela, you mentioned the geography involved here and the long 3 blocks, Darlene, that you refer to. But if you think about that structurally, these 3 churches almost exactly form the perimeter around the most diverse area of Nassau Bay, where people are majority renters as opposed to homeowners, etc. You know, so it's right there in the midst of the 3 of us, and we haven't found ways to work together to meet and address those needs. I don't know that we can, Mike, for the reasons that you've voiced. We've tried different things over the years, but it is interesting that those 3 churches form a border around the very area that we've been talking about for so long, and we can't get in. We can't seem to reach them.
This, I think, needs to be something we spend more time on, because the neighborhood doesn't want those apartments there. The police don't want those apartments there. The people really don't even want to live there. So there's this sort of, that I think would be a really interesting topic sometime.
So you're pointing to something that most people miss, because we think about intersectionality and we think race and gender, but social class.
Yeah.
And that conveys a lot about us, right? Depending on which social class you're a member of.
And I'm wondering how the taking over of the strip mall, which has had several sequential effects. One, to remove what my understanding was a large grocery store that served the area. And then most recently to remove the Dollar General, which, as I think most of us know, is the primary place where many impoverished individuals shop. It's gone now.
Yes, it is.
And I'm wondering how that may affect residency in Nassau Bay, because where do you go if you don't have transportation and don't have money? You know, where do you go to get simple groceries?
Yeah. Yeah, there's not an alternative.
No.
Well, I do have to honor our time, because some people are maybe still going to church at 10:30. I am not. I am playing hooky today. Desi, really fantastic presentation, and this is the kind of thing we're going to follow up on in a couple of weeks. Next week, we're going to hear a presentation from Graciela on the Latinx experience that I'm really, really looking forward to. It's going to center on the poem Yo Soy Joaquin and some of Graciela's own heritage growing up in Texas. Is that 6th generation? 10th. Okay. So you will want to be here for that. And again, Desi, you're just giving us a good platform to have the conversations like the one we started to have. That I think outside of like, hey, what not only what can we do as a parish, but how can we become involved in our own city at the city politics level to make some more opportunities. So really, really appreciate your time on a Sunday morning.
Thank you so much for the invitation. I'm delighted to know all of you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Lovely to hear you.
See you all soon.
Thanks, Desi. Thanks all.
Thank